Hey everybody, we're back with the Menschwarmers, your bi-weekly look at the world of Jews and sports. Gabe, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. It's been a big week for Jews, for the pro and anti-Jewish sides of sports. Excited to get into it and chat about it. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I unfortunately missed our interview that's coming up later on the podcast with Fred Katz. That's coming up in a few minutes. Unfortunately, I had a family emergency. Daughter had to go to the hospital, broken leg, but she's back. Everything's good, and she's a real trooper, so she's fine. So everything's good on my end, but some things to catch up on in the world of Jews and sports. As I said, we have an interview coming up with Fred Katz of The Athletic. He's a Washington Wizards beat writer, and we talked to him a lot about his job as a writer and the Washington Wizards' newest player, Deni Avdija from Israel.
So I want to pause you there for a second.
Yeah.
I know that night you did have that family issue, and unfortunately you couldn't be as part of the interview. But during the interview, Fred did correct a Seinfeld reference I made.
Oh,
so
wow.
That was also a tragedy that happened to me.
Wow. What was the reference you made?
It was about Joe DiMaggio. In the interview, Fred refers to a conversation he had with Carmelo Anthony about Joe DiMaggio. I'm not going to ruin it for our listeners, but then I said, well, maybe he just got messed up because of Seinfeld. And then I got the about Joe DiMaggio's appearance on Seinfeld.
Well, he wasn't in Seinfeld, but he was referred to in Seinfeld.
And now it's happened twice.
Okay. Well, that's too bad. Gabe, as a veteran of our Seinfeld trivia team, the Spongeworthy, I would expect your Seinfeld trivia knowledge to be a little better.
I misspoke. The Menschwarmers is a free-flowing conversation.
I hear you.
It gets to these parts, and Fred and I had a good kibitz going, so That's how it is.
Well, I think the focus of our episode, or one of the reasons we want to interview Fred, was to talk about Deni Avdija, who he was drafted by the Washington Wizards in the ninth overall in the first round in the 2020 draft. He'd been playing at Maccabi Tel Aviv for a bit. He's his dad's a Serbian Israeli basketball player. His mom's Israeli,
and he's only 21, so he's rookie age.
Yeah, I think he just turned. No, I think he's just 20.
Just 20. Wow.
I think he just turned 20. He was only eligible last year, I think, to come out, or maybe the year before. But either way, I mean, he's had a decent start at Washington. I think he's someone that can really captivate the Jewish audience because he's the first Israeli in the NBA since Omri Caspi, who had a decent career. Like, he had a pretty long career in the end. Omri Caspi, I don't think he's still playing.
He has a couple of rings, and we we get to that in the conversation. Talking, there's only ever really been a handful of guys that made the leap from Israel. The Israeli league to the NBA, even fewer actually Israeli players.
Right.
There's been a couple Americans who have played there and played back. Anthony Parker's one that comes to mind.
Sure.
And Deni has a couple of guys from Omri Caspi before him. Caspi, our producer, is actually sending me a note. Omri Caspi still playing pro ball back in Maccabi Tel Aviv.
Oh, good for him. We probably should have kept more up with Omri than we have. But, I think that a lot of something we've talked a lot on the podcast about is the sort of affinity from Jewish sports fans or Jewish athletes that one of the things that got us interested in doing this is the idea of when you're a Jewish sports fan, you always think, who is Jewish? Is this guy with the last name Jewish? His last name's Freddie Freeman. That sounds like he could be Jewish. Let's look it up. Oh, no, he turns out he went to Catholic school or something like that. I don't know if Freddie Freeman did. I'm just saying. Yeah, but I think it's been a while since there's been a Jewish basketball player in the NBA who's really captured that. Omri Caspi, as we said, Jordan Farmar is Jewish, and again has a ring with someone who was a fan favorite for a while among the Jewish crowd.
And it's important to know, and Fred discusses this at length at the interview. It's how Deni actually has a chance to be one of those athletes who isn't just the Jewish guy. A lot of the athletes, we've talked about this before, he's seen as an actual future cornerstone of the team and not just sort of a novelty act.
Right. And that's what I was going to say. I mean, Omri Caspi was, late draft pick, decent career. Jordan Farmar, role player. Okay. But we haven't had in our lifetimes, and it's probably almost in our parents' lifetimes, a Jewish basketball player who's been, an all-star, someone who could be an MVP. Aside from Amare, yes, Amare, but Amare didn't become Jewish until after he retired. So he wasn't really celebrated as a Jewish athlete, maybe a little bit when he went to the Knicks, but he didn't spend most of his career in the focus of the Jewish fan base as the guy to watch.
Yet now I think as a coach, he's taking Shabbos off. He's not coaching Friday night or Saturday afternoon games.
Right. He's full Orthodox now, and hopefully finding somewhere in Brooklyn somewhere in Brooklyn. To attend services. It must be hard finding places there.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if he's the tallest and most Nubian of complexion at your average Satmar synagogue.
He's really like the only guy who can walk from Williamsburg to Bed-Stuy and not skip a beat, I guess. unlike the other Satmars who are around him. Anyways. But yeah, so I think Deni has a real chance to be the Jewish superstar, in the NBA, and we'll see what happens. Don't want to put the cart in front of the horse here, but he's a guy that we can watch for years and who can really captivate the Jewish fan base. That even if you're a fan of your local team, you're also keeping an eye out for Deni, and it's interesting to see what the Washington Wizards have done in that regard. And I know you talked to Fred a little bit about that, about the sort of the reason why the Wizards picked him and the marketing opportunities there.
It's an interesting conversation, and a really interesting challenge, I think, comes with there are a lot of players, and especially Jewish players. This is certainly something we've talked about in the past, with Nate Thompson, the Montreal Canadian, and again with Fred here, is that when you draft a Jewish player, when you are a Jewish player, you get a lot of new fans really, really quickly. Something Ike Davis has said, he always known as Jewish, but as soon as he got traded to the Mets, Jewish people really, really became a big fan of his. And he got a lot more into his religion after he realized how much it meant to people.
And of course, the Washington DMV area has plenty of Jewish basketball fans in it. And this gives them a real guy to cheer for. I mean, it's similar to sometimes being Canadian, when there's a Canadian pro in a sport that Canadians don't play a ton of. We all know about, Steve Nash. Everyone I knew growing up was a Steve Nash fan, if you were Canadian, even though came from a different part of Canada than we were from. It was nice to have a Canadian MVP. Or, you and I have previously on this podcast celebrated Laurent Duvernay-Tardif, the Canadian McGill alum who was a Chiefs lineman, because, we share some demographics with him. So this is just another angle for that. And, it's exciting to see a Jew play basketball, an Israeli play basketball at this high level, and really wish him the best. And I'm sure his career is something we'll be following for a long time.
Agreed. So before we get to the interview with Fred, let's talk a little bit about the week. Something I want to talk about earlier, a little bit. Former UFC fighter and I guess sci-fi pinup girl Gina Carano has now been canceled for doing an anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Do you watch The Mandalorian?
I have not.
It's
I feel
really
like I've heard it's very good, but now my boycott is principled for having missed her earlier. And I see.
It's always nice when you get the opportunity to continue to not watch something that you already weren't watching, but now it's for a good reason. Well, she's going to be off The Mandalorian, and there's a spin-off. So there's a spin-off show that she was going to be part of. And Disney, I think, announced that they were doing something like 12 Star Wars spin-off shows. And, they're all like real star-making opportunities. And she got fired from that. Disney said they don't want anything to do with her. She made an Instagram post that basically said that conservatives these days are treated like Jews were in Nazi Germany. I'm just gonna quote from the post here. Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children, she wrote. Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews. How is that any different from hating someone for their political views? And again, she's an outspoken conservative, and I think sort of QAnon adjacent person. This has come up in the past, and obviously she had already been sort of on the radar as being like a COVID truther QAnon person. But then this sort of thing saying like, oh, well, being a conservative these days, just like being a Jew during Nazi Germany. I mean, I'm glad that was the bridge too far, I guess. I'm glad something was.
Well, now she's going back she's I guess returned to the Joe Rogan cinematic universe, and from the Star Wars one to make some project with Ben Shapiro.
Oh, right.
Who let me tell you, that guy sucks.
Yeah, that guy sucks hard. Well, I saw people on the CJN Lounge, the new Facebook page for the CJN, commenting on this, and people were really mad about cancel culture, even when it came to Gina Carano. So keep on posting your opinions there, I guess, boomers.
I'm just curious. I find most of the people who get canceled, do have a past of getting elbowed in the side of the head for a living.
Oh, that's a good point. Should we not be making fun of her so much, because we're going to find out in a few years that this is all due to CTE from putting her body through terrible, terrible things, and she just has a series of concussions that have caused her to be an anti-Semite?
I mean, that's certainly. You know what? I wouldn't call it a excuse, more of an explanation.
Right. I mean, it's like it's not an excuse for murdering your wife just because you used to be a star running back, but it's an explanation when you're I don't want to name names here because he got acquitted, but let's just say if a certain former Buffalo Bills running back killed his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, it might have been because he had CTE as well, or has CTE as well. So, but as the great Adam Sandler said, O.J. Simpson, not a Jew. Yeah. Before we get to the interview, just checking in on a few Jewish sports stories that we've been following. Australian Open's going on. Unfortunately, we were so primed for a matchup between our two Jewish tennis boys, Diego Schwartzman and Denis Shapovalov. They were going to meet in the fourth round, and they both lost in the third. So they're two blonde tennis playing Jews. Yeah, really right. Hitler's nightmare right there. Oh boy. Yeah, well, they both lost in the third round of the Australian Open. Too bad. They'll have more chances this year. Shapo didn't look great. I didn't get a chance to watch Diego play, but hopefully we'll have more chances to talk about them. I really do think Shapo was laboring a bit. Yeah, he was laboring a bit. Lost to another Canadian, Felix, not Jewish as far as we can tell. But we are following Shapo sort of aggressively. Also, as we record this, we'll find out what happens on tomorrow, I guess, before this episode airs. But Daniel Berger, former sort of friend of the pod, is either tied for the lead or just behind the leader at the Pebble Beach Open. Is he? I haven't been following at all. So that's like the first big tournament of the year, the AT&T Pro-Am at Pebble Beach. Usually the Jews are on the Am side. But he's one on the pro side. Yeah, I usually get like a good smattering of like Jewish Hollywood celebrities playing in the amateur side, but good to see him on the pro side. Who's he playing with? Do you know? Today he was playing with Spieth. I think tomorrow it looks like he'll probably be with Patrick Cantley or Nate Lashley. Okay. Daniel Berger, someone we talked about in the last episode, and someone who I think has taken on more of our focus in the interim of our podcast, because he is just rocketing to the top of the standings, and he is someone who is going to have a huge year in golf. Likely a huge career. He's still quite young with a number of wins. Still quite young, but I'm saying this is really the year to start watching. If you're interested in following a Jewish golfer as he hits his stride, it's Daniel Berger. I think he's absolutely going to win some tournaments this year. I think he's going to be in contention on Sundays in majors. He's a guy who really is going to hit his mark. The Masters are only 2.5 months away now, so he's got a real chance there. He's got to play on Shabbos. He's got to play on Shabbos. That's part of the deal. It's been a long time since there's been a pro athlete who hasn't played on Shabbos, to be honest. So aside from Amari's coaching, that's been it. Exactly. He's a little bit different than Amari in that sense. Yeah. So, Gabe, let's move to your interview with Fred Katz of The Athletic. Absolutely. Please enjoy this chat. We get to talking about Deni. We get to talking about the DC bagel scene. We talk a little bit about Fred's career history, Oklahoma Judaism, and it's a fun chat. So please enjoy. So, Fred, tell me a little bit about yourself. You're working for The Athletic, covering the Wizards. You from DC? Did you grow up in DC?
From New York City. Moved to DC to cover the Wizards in 2018. This is my third season on the Wizards beat. Was doing the Thunder and the Celtics briefly before that, and eventually went over to DC to cover the team over here.
And so you've been with The Athletic this whole time. How long have you been there?
So I went to The Athletic for the Wizards beat as well. For the Wizards. I was at Mass Live doing the Celtics for a short amount of time, and before that, I was covering the Thunder for the Norman Transcript.
Wow. Norman, Oklahoma.
Norman, Oklahoma. Homa University of
Were
Oklahoma.
you the Jewish guy there?
I was the Jewish guy there. I was absolutely the Jewish guy there not just in the state, just in the Midwest sans Chicago.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'd love to go to Branson, Missouri, Oklahoma one day, see that real extra Christian lifestyle.
I loved my time in OKC. It was great.
Really?
Yeah, I loved it there. I had a great job. I was working with great people. I got to just go to Thunder games all the time and just live and breathe, what it was like to be on an NBA beat, which was an incredible first NBA beat experience. And, I covered Russell Westbrook's MVP year, which was crazy. And I feel like I've just kind of got stories, quite honestly, enough stories to fill a book from my time covering the Thunder, which was only a couple of years, but so much happened with that organization when I was there, from Durant leaving to Westbrook taking the organization on his back and then winning an MVP, and then the Melo trade, and then the Paul George trade, and all just so much unbelievable turnover and so many personalities there. And there was always so much drama that I feel like there's enough to fill an entire career. So it was a great first beat experience, and I have a lot of friends from there. So I would do it again a million times out of a million.
And you got a book idea.
There you go. Exactly. A book that is currently not leaving any place but my mind, but yes.
You know what? That's the first challenge. So it's great to have you here on the Bench Warmers, where I just tell you a little bit about what we do. We sort of find the Jewish stories in sports, update people on our listeners on what's new in the Jewish world, what's anti-Semitic and what isn't when it comes to sports is a big issue, who's Jewish and who's not. But you cover the Washington Wizards, notably recently added to their team, drafted this year, is probably the greatest Jewish basketball player, in the league now. I don't want to say ever, and Amare is still coaching, but he is certainly the first Israeli player in a long time, other than Omri Caspi, to actually have a shot at making a difference. And so, one thing I think we're all wondering, do the Wizards have a lot of new fans?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I mean, based on my Twitter following, I would say, yeah. And it's funny because the Wizards, it's not just Deni, but they have more international players than any other team in the league. They've got 7 or 8 guys who weren't born in the U.S., so they've got the Latvian fans because they've got Bertans, and the Japanese fans because they have Rui Hachimura, and the German fans because they have Mo Wagner and Isak Bonga, and the list goes on. They've got Raul Neto, and they've got a number of other international players too, so they've got this very diverse group of players on their roster with all this diverse background. Alex Len, who's from the Ukraine, and so it's just all these players from all over the world. And I feel like they bring in a little bit of a following from each, but I will say it seems, just based on my anecdotal experience, that the most passionate followings for particular players are the Deni fans and the Rui fans.
Well, I think, I speak for a lot of Jews, something that when we spoke to, there's a guy on the PGA Tour named Max Homa. And as soon as we told him, hey, we're a podcast about Jewish athletes, his first reaction was, there aren't very many of us. So I think, anytime somebody sees a Jewish athlete or an Israeli athlete, especially in sort of Western sports, a lot of people tend to put a lot of hopes and dreams on them really, really quickly. And that, I think that's certainly happening with Deni. And I think the Wizards have leaned into that. Maybe I noticed that the Wizards have certainly, they have a Twitter account in Hebrew now, and they're tweeting a lot of his highlights in Hebrew. I saw they tweeted a bunch of Deni. Deni had a big game yesterday against the Raptors, one of the bigger ones of his year so far, it seems. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about sort of what the Wizards are doing to embrace this.
Yeah, they certainly embrace this kind of stuff. They have the Twitter account. I believe they have a website in Hebrew as well. They have an Instagram handle, and they did the exact same thing when they drafted Rui Hachimura too with the Japanese fans. They brought in an entire Japanese social media team for Hachimura that basically just runs parallel to the social media team they already had employed. And they did a similar thing with a Twitter handle and an Instagram handle and all of that. So I think the Wizards organizationally dive into this a lot, and it's not just with Deni, it's with any of their international guys who could potentially have a large following in the countries that they're from. Deni is definitely no exception because they've done it, and I have seen the fans. They tweet at me. They're very passionate.
So in your mind, what comes first? Is it the business decision that leads to the international team, or is the international team that leads to the global marketing strategy?
It's a good chicken or egg question. I like to think it's the international team that leads to the global strategy. I also don't think that when the GM of the Wizards, Tommy Shepard, goes to ownership and says, we'd like to take Rui Hachimura and we'd like to take Deni Avdija, that it's not like ownership is being like, oh dear, don't do that. So I think it's really been an embrace from both sides. I think ownership is, it's clear, ownership has seen dollar signs with the draft picks that it's taking. Because if it weren't clear, then, or I should say, if they weren't doing that, they wouldn't be creating the new websites. They wouldn't be creating the social media accounts and all those sorts of things. So I think it's clear that ownership is seeing a financial opportunity there. But I also think it starts with the basketball. I mean, they drafted Hachimura because they believed in him. They believed in his basketball. And they drafted Deni because he was really high on their draft board. I don't know exactly what number they had him, but he was pretty significantly higher than 9th, which is where they took him. I would feel pretty confident saying he was in their top 5 or 6. So, you know, when a guy who's in their top 5 or 6 ends up falling, I know they didn't expect him to come to 9. They did not. They didn't even really think that much about drafting him because they were pretty confident he was going to be gone by the time they got to the 9th pick. So I know for them, it started with him as a basketball perspective. They have a lot of faith in him as a player, and then the economics of it builds out from there.
Of course. And you mentioned earlier, you've got a lot of fans, you know, coming after you. Do any of them, I mean, other than us, of course, realize or reach out to you talking about you being Jewish? And maybe if you as a reporter have a sort of a kinship with him?
Yes. And it's funny because I have never discussed it with Deni. I don't think I've ever asked him anything about being Jewish. Because if somebody asked me, like, I don't think he's particularly religious either. And I'm not a particularly religious person either. I was raised Jewish and I am Jewish and my parents are Jewish, but I'm not really much of a practicing Jew.
Did you go to camp at least?
Yes, I went to camp. It's very Jew. I'm a stereotypical Jew. I am the exact kind of person who you would stereotype as Jewish in every way possible.
A friend of mine likes to call himself obviously Jewish.
Yes, that's exactly what I am. I am obviously Jewish. There's no hiding me from anybody. But if somebody were constantly asking me in a media scrum what it meant for me to be Jewish, I would almost feel like I had to be disingenuous in that moment, or I would come off as a jerk, you know? And so I don't really know what to ask that hasn't already been asked. And don't get me wrong, there's been some really good stuff written about it. Yaron Weitzman, and I've been on Yaron's podcast before. He's a friend of mine and wrote at Bleacher Report, and he just does a great job. I really admire the work that he does. And he wrote a lot about Deni's history, and I thought did a really great job. And just from my perspective, it just nothing meaningful has really hit me from that front yet. If something really stood out, and it's a little different this year because access is so different with the world being so different. Normally I'm in the locker room pregame, I'm in the locker room postgame. I have opportunities just to kind of have small talk with these guys, just have little chats here and there about the world and whatever, just to, hey, how you doing? What's new? How you liking living in DC? You watch the Super Bowl, just like any sort of small talk chat, which, most of the words that are exchanged between me and a player that I cover don't come in a scrum when the world is normal. And now all of them come in some sort of public Zoom setting. I haven't met Deni in person, which is crazy to me. If you told me a year ago the Wizards are going to have a first-round pick, you're going to be a Wizards beat writer, and you're going to have not met him months and months after they drafted him, I'd be like, that's insanity. I will see him every single day for like 7 months straight. What are you talking about? So the fact that I haven't met him is just really it's just a weird situation. And I feel like a lot of those questions, a lot of those storylines, they come from the small talk. You get into the small talk and then they see something interesting and you're like, oh, you know what? That could be an interesting story. That could be an interesting thing to ask about in an on the record setting where I can quote you, you know, and not having those settings, I feel like hurts those sorts of stories for sure.
For sure. Well, I'd imagine you guys haven't really, discussed the Israeli election in great detail, but do you think it matters to him to be a Jewish representative in your experience?
He's said that it does. I mean, he has said that it does, so I will take him at his word for it that it does. I mean, he gets quite, because we get a lot of Israeli media members, especially on the Zooms now, talking to him, and he hasn't been asked that question as much lately because I think he's just answered it a bunch of times. Yep. But he has said that it totally means something to him. I think he takes pride in representing Israeli fans and knows how many Israeli fans that he has. And I think it's something that definitely means something to him. Cause I mean, just how many Israeli basketball players have there been? There's to play in the NBA. There's Caspi.
Yeah. And
is that the only one?
That might be it. I remember, we're from Toronto. Our podcast is based out of Toronto. And when Anthony Parker played for the Raptors, he had come from Maccabi Tel Aviv. And he was sort of treated as an Israeli basketball player, even though he was American.
Right.
But
I mean, that's kind of what happened with Amari.
Absolutely.
Amari never really converted. He just kind of embraced Judaism unless I'm wrong about this, and he actually did, and something changed.
I think he's converting now.
Okay. Because for a long time, he just kind of embraced the spirituality of Judaism, right? And he embraced the scriptures and the culture. But
I think if you see him in street clothes now, he's like wearing tefillin and a fur hat. So whether or not he's actually gone through like the year of praying and whatnot, like he's definitely cosplaying real hard.
Right. Well,
that's good enough for me.
Totally. Well, we get really excited when there's a Jewish athlete because there aren't very many of them.
There aren't very many.
So we're just that's
the whole point of our show.
Jordan Farmar is half Jewish.
Yep.
But not Israeli.
Not Israeli. There was actually a rumor that went around for a while, and we had on the show Eric Kareen from the Toronto Athletic to talk about
good
it.
Friend, yeah.
That is a wonderful guy. That Fred VanVleet was secretly Jewish. He's not, but people believed that for a while.
Well, there was also TJ Leaf, I thought was Jewish for a while because he was born in Southern California and he was raised in Israel.
Right.
And grew up in Israel because his dad was a pro player in Israel. And I thought he was Jewish. I'm like, Southern California, Israel.
Right.
Is it
that
not
fits.
Jewish? Not Jewish.
Yeah, well, do you know the Mike Jacobs story?
The baseball player?
The baseball player. We have a segment on our podcast where we talk about Mike Jacobs players, but his face was once given on Jewish heritage shirts in Miami where he played. He's not Jewish. They just thought he was. Yeah, it was tremendous. It's a great piece of Jewish sports lore.
That's great. Carmelo Anthony once tried to convince me that Joe DiMaggio was Jewish.
Why? How'd that happen?
He genuinely thought that Joe DiMaggio was Jewish. This is one of the stories where I'll save the full details for the book.
Right.
But he genuinely thought Joe DiMaggio was Jewish, and he and another player, Josh Eustace, spent about 15 minutes aggressively trying to convince me that Joe DiMaggio was Jewish. And I was like, bro, I'm a Jew from New York whose father is a diehard Yankee fan. If Joe DiMaggio were Jewish, my name would be Joe DiMaggio Katz. And
right.
And they weren't backing down.
Is it because he was on Seinfeld?
He wasn't on Seinfeld. He was only mentioned on Seinfeld as
his silhouette was on Seinfeld.
Silhouette was on Seinfeld because he dunks his donuts.
Yeah, they watched him dunk the donut.
But he was not. He was Steinbrennered on Seinfeld.
Yes, exactly. I wonder if they asked and he wouldn't go. That's my assumption. As a Yankees fan, as a Jewish person, sports fan, who was your favorite Jewish athlete of all time? Everyone has one.
I mean, I was always fascinated by Hank Greenberg. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, the answer is probably Sandy Koufax, because my dad would always tell me about the Sandy Koufax curveball. And my grandfather was a big Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And my grandfather was really the one who got me into baseball. He took me to my first baseball game, and he was from Brooklyn, and he took me to my first baseball game, which was a Mets game. not a Yankees game.
At Old Shea.
Yes, at Old Shea. And I heard, all I heard about was the Sandy Koufax curveball. And I've seen many clips of the Sandy Koufax curveball, and it was a crazy curveball. And I think the answer is just Sandy Koufax says, it's not a greatness thing with Koufax. It's, some great players just kind of have more legendary stories than other great players. Like Satchel Paige is the king of a great athlete with just so many legendary stories. Like his greatness is in his legendary stories, even more than in his performance. I feel like Koufax has so many legendary stories about him telling someone he was going to throw a curveball and
doing it anyway,
still striking them out. Or, Sandy Koufax was tipping his pitches this one game, and everybody knew he was tipping his pitches, and then he threw a one-hitter. And just like so many just the length of his fingers, and like all of these crazy Koufax stories. So
it's interesting because, at least to a Jewish person, and I think the same thing will probably be true of Deni in a lot of cases, in that, he might win 10 championships, but he'll be the Israeli guy who won 10 championships. And he'll be the Jewish guy who won 10 championships. And in the Koufax context, he's the guy who wouldn't play on Yom Kippur. Yeah. So to bring this back to Deni and the Wizards for a minute, do you think if someone is a Jewish athlete or an Israeli athlete like him or like Koufax, can he ever get past that? Not that it's something to get past, but, will that always define him in the NBA?
That's a good question. Yeah, probably. Is there this might just be because I'm Jewish, but is there a Jewish athlete who, when you talk about them, one of the first things that you think of when you're listing off their descriptors, no matter how good or bad that player was in his or her respective sport, is there one Jewish athlete who you think of when you're listing off their descriptors that you don't mention that, like, Sue Bird is Jewish?
Right. We talk about Sue Bird a lot on this show, but no. I think the answer is no. Maybe Kevin Youkilis, because a lot of people don't know.
Here's the thing. You can't outdo it, because the tone around saying that person is Jewish just changes depending on their accomplishments. So with like Jordan Farmar, you'll be like, yeah, the point guard from UCLA played like 10 years in the league. Oh, did you know Jordan Farmar is half Jewish? And that's when you get to it in the Jordan Farmar conversation. And with Sandy Koufax, you're like, oh, greatest Jewish pitcher of all time, man. Greatest Jewish athlete of all time. Or Hank Greenberg, you're like, it's the best Jewish hitter ever. And it's just like the gravitas behind it becomes less of a shrug and more of a boast. And that's the difference. The tone will change depending on your accomplishments, but it's like it is always that's always going to be one of the things.
And they could totally suck too. Like, and maybe suck's the wrong word, but not have a very distinguished career at all.
We've said Caspi's name on this podcast like 6 times.
Totally. Hey, he's got a couple of rings, but you think about, I'm thinking of, Jay Fiedler, who's if you're a football fan,
Dolphins great.
Dolphins great. Jay Fiedler. Like, he might have thrown 2 touchdowns in his career, but he's Jewish. Like, we got a guy. He's almost there.
Yep.
I think that the key, at least for us as Jews, is that for a lot of people, that is the most defining thing about them, regardless of how successful they are. And people talk about Deni as if he's going to break that mold. And sort of that's the reason, he's the greatest Israeli player we've had so far. He's your prototypical European point forward who he can pass, he can rebound, he can shoot, but he's still the Jewish guy.
Yeah. I mean, he's good. He's going to be a nice player. He looks really comfortable and he handles well. He's a good passer. I think he can do more stuff with the ball than we've really seen him do so far. With Westbrook and Beal playing together, then he doesn't really have as many opportunities. He's coming off the bench now as of a couple of games ago, so I think he might have more opportunities to do that kind of stuff with bench lineups, but he's been good. He looks solid, so I think he'll have a nice long career.
This is a niche call-out, but that was quite the alley-oop pass he made to Westbrook last night. They showed it about 1 million times, on TV this morning as I was watching highlights preparing for this interview. But he's got highlight real potential, and he's like we said, he's going to be a nice player.
Yeah, but I think he's going to be a nice defender too. He'll have a good long career.
Well, I would hope so, and I think there are a lot of Israeli fans that would hope so too. Especially, wake up at 4 a.m. and watch some basketball. One other thing I wanted to ask you, just sort of about life now: how much Judaism is there in DC? Like, I know nothing about the DC Jewish scene. Is there like a bagel scene? Is there like a synagogue?
The bagel scene is really disappointing. You would think it would be good. The bagel scene and the Jewish deli scene is not great. And it's a really good food city. There's one place called Call Your Mother, which is pretty good bagels. But it's more of like an adventurous bagel sort of deal than it is. Joe Biden went there recently.
I was about to say, is that the Joe Biden place? I feel like all of the bagel and deli places are meant for people like Joe Biden. Like, not actually meant for, to watch your Zeta eat soup and spill it all over himself. Like,
exactly. It's not like a throwback traditional place.
New York style place.
Like it's good bagels. Don't get me wrong. They're totally good bagels, but it's like more adventurous and kind of out there and different kind of funky stuff you'll put on bagels. And it's not like New York, I'll tell you that much.
No, well, if you're in Toronto in 18 months or whenever the country is open, we can get bagels and we'll chat about regional differences.
I love Toronto.
Oh, good.
Great city, great food city. Love Toronto.
Great food city. But I don't need to take up any of your time. This was great. It was great chatting, about Deni and sort of about the NBA and Jewish athletes. It's always a good conversation with journalists, especially, proudly, culturally Jewish ones like yourself.
Yes, thanks for having me.
It was a great chat. Had a very nice time with Fred. It was good to talk to him and hear sort of about him and about how Washington's taken to Deni.
Yeah, and thanks so much to Fred Katz for joining us. You can find him on Twitter at Fred Katz, all one word, and you can read his writing at The Athletic. You do have to pay for a subscription. That's their business model. But you don't have to pay for us, which is nice. And my producer has just informed me that unfortunately I used a bit of a slur, what we're told is a slur, that I referred to the boomers on the CJN Lounge. And I just want to apologize. I only mean, my parents are boomers. Some of my best friends are boomers. I don't mean any harm by it. Please keep commenting on our Facebook page, the CJN's Facebook page, the CJN Lounge. We love reading your comment and your feedback on all the sports stories or whether you think Seth Rogen and John Kay are newsworthy or not. It's great.
I find personally, I've known Jamie a long time, and he's the least ageist person you've ever met in your life.
This isn't who I am,
This is not who he is.
It's not who I am.
It never should have happened, and it won't happen again.
Yeah. Until next time, please hit us up on Twitter at Menschwarmers. You can follow the CJN Podcast Network on Facebook. You can follow the CJN Lounge on Facebook. You can, if you're listening to us on a podcast service, then you're already doing it right. If you're listening to us on the website, you can subscribe to us on whatever podcast service you are.
And please review us. Write some good reviews, a lot of stars. We could use that. That helps. As always, today's episode was produced by Michael Freeman. Who, as we're seeing here, the executive producer of the CJN Podcast Network, is looking quite bearded.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks with more news about Jews and sports.